The street was full of life on a cool morning. People were setting up their carts, selling things, while others sipped coffee and looked at their phones. Cars honked in the distance, filling the air with noise. Keanu Reeves sat on a quiet bench near the park. He wore a simple black hoodie and old jeans. He blended in with the crowd, just another person in the busy city. He stared at the ground, lost in thought. But then he heard a soft whimper. He looked up and saw a stray dog slowly walking out of a small alley. The dog looked weak. Its fur was messy and dirty, and its body was covered in strange, hard lumps, almost like rusty stuck to its skin. The dog moved carefully, its tail low, as people walked past without even looking at it. Nearby, a group of teenagers laughed. They threw small rocks at the dog to make it go away. The dog yelped and backed into a corner, shaking with fear. Keanu frowned. He got up from the bench and walked toward the dog. His steps were slow and gentle. One of the teenagers called out, "Hey man, don't bother. It's just a dirty stray. Probably sick." Keanu ignored them. He crouched down a few feet from the dog and stretched out his hand carefully. The dog growled a little, unsure if Keanu was a friend or not. Keanu spoke softly, "It's okay, buddy. I won't hurt you." A woman walking by saw him and made a face. "Are you serious? That thing looks gross. You'll get sick if you touch it." Keanu glanced at her. His face stayed calm. Sometimes all it takes is someone to care. The woman had no response. She just frowned and walked away. The dog took a small step forward, sniffing the air near Keanu. He reached into his pocket and took out a piece of bread from breakfast. He broke it into small pieces and put them on the ground. The dog sniffed the food carefully, then started eating. "Good boy," Keanu said with a small smile. But as he looked closer, his smile faded. The strange lumps on the dog's body weren't just on the outside. They looked deep and painful. His heart sank. Behind him, a man in a suit stepped out of a building. He fixed his tie and stared at Keanu with a frown. "What are you doing?" the man asked, sounding annoyed. "You can't just bring stray animals here. This is private property." Keanu stood up and looked at the man. "I didn't know kindness had rules." The man scoffed. "Look, whoever you are, this is a fancy neighborhood. People don't want to see this kind of mess." He waved his hand at the dog like it was trash. Keanu tilted his head slightly. His eyes narrowed just a little. "Maybe the mess isn't the dog," he said. The man shifted uncomfortably. But before he could say anything, the dog suddenly collapsed onto its side, whimpering. Keanu dropped to his knees. His hands hovered over the dog, afraid to touch it too much in case it hurt. A small crowd gathered, whispering. Some looked curious, others disapproving. "What's wrong with it?" someone asked. Keanu didn't look up. "Neglect. That's what's wrong with it." The air felt heavy. People murmured, but no one stepped forward to help. The dog's breathing was slow and weak. Keanu clenched his jaw. He had to do something. "I need a vet," he said firmly. He stood up and looked around. "Does anyone know where the closest one is?" The man in the suit rolled his eyes. "Good luck. No Dr. Evelyn Carter is going to waste their time on that thing." Keanu's eyes locked onto him. His voice was colder now. "I wasn't asking for your opinion." The crowd fell silent. Finally, a young girl stepped forward, holding her phone. "There's a clinic a few blocks from here. I can show you." Keanu nodded at her. "Thank you." Carefully, he took off his hoodie and wrapped the dog in it before lifting it into his arms. The crowd parted as he walked, watching in silence. The girl led him through the busy streets. She kept looking at him like she recognized him but said nothing. Keanu walked with quiet focus, cradling the dog. Its weak breathing made his heart ache, but he kept whispering, "Hang in there, buddy. We're almost there." Finally, they reached a small building with a faded sign, Haven Veterinary Care. The girl hesitated, pointing at it. "That's the one." Keanu nodded and gave her a small smile. "Thanks. You didn't have to help, but you did. That means a lot." The girl blushed, unsure what to say. Keanu stepped inside. A bell chimed as he walked in. The receptionist looked up, her bored expression changing to surprise when she saw the sick dog in his arms. "Oh my, what happened?" she asked. Keanu stepped closer. His voice was calm but urgent. "I found it on the street. It's in bad shape, covered in these weird growths. It's struggling to breathe." The receptionist stood up quickly and called for a vet. A woman in a lab coat walked in, pulling on gloves. She motioned to Keanu. "Bring it here." Keanu gently placed the dog on the exam table and stepped back. Dr. Evelyn Carter frowned as she checked the dog. "These aren't just skin problems," she muttered. "Some of these are parasites, buried deep. This poor thing has been suffering for a long time. Keanu's jaw tightened. Can you help it? Dr. Evelyn Carter looked at him seriously. It'll take time. And money. Treatments like this aren't easy. Before Keanu could say anything, the receptionist added, we usually ask for a deposit first, especially for stray animals. Sometimes people just leave them here and never come back. The room went quiet. Dr. Evelyn Carter looked a little uncomfortable. Keanu looked down at the dog. It was shaking on the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Without hesitation, he said, whatever it costs, I'll pay. The receptionist blinked, surprised. She glanced at his wallet, noticing a simple card inside with a name she didn't recognize but that seemed important. She hesitated, then nodded. All right. We'll start right away. Dr. Evelyn Carter got to work as Keanu stepped back, watching. He stood near the window looking at the busy world outside. People walked past, chatting, laughing, completely unaware of the little life struggling inside this clinic. His thoughts drifted, memories flickering in his mind like old movie clips. The receptionist's voice pulled him back. You know, most people wouldn't go through this much trouble for a stray. Why are you doing this? Keanu turned to her. His eyes were distant but full of meaning. Because someone once did the same for me, he said softly. Dr. Evelyn Carter looked up from her work. She was focused as she injected a sedative into the dog. You've been through something like this? Keanu's lips curved into a small, sad smile. Not exactly like this, but I know what it feels like to be abandoned. To feel like you don't matter. Dr. Evelyn Carter paused, her face softening. Well, she said gently, this little guy matters now. Let's hope he pulls through. The clinic was quiet, except for the sound of Dr. Evelyn Carter working. The dog's breathing steadied just a little. And as Keanu watched, he knew this wasn't just about saving the dog. It was about something more. Keanu felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He took it out and looked at the screen. There were many missed calls and messages, all from the same unknown number. He sighed and put the phone back in his pocket. Outside, the girl who had helped him find the animal clinic was still there. She pretended to tie her shoelaces, but really she was watching him through the window. She was curious. There was something different about him. Earlier, she had seen how calm and brave he was when facing the man in the suit. Something about Keanu didn't quite make sense, and she wanted to know more. Inside the clinic, Dr. Evelyn Carter was busy helping the dog. At the front desk, the receptionist whispered to her coworker, I think I've seen him before. Isn't he? But Dr. Evelyn Carter gently shook her head. It doesn't matter who he is. Right now, he's just someone who cares. The receptionist nodded, but she couldn't stop wondering about him. Keanu stood by the window watching the sun go down. The sky was turning orange and pink. The dog lay on the table, sleeping because of the medicine. It was safe for now. Dr. Evelyn Carter finally stepped back, taking off her gloves. She looked tired. I did what I could, she said to Keanu. The parasites are gone, but the infection is bad. The next 24 hours are very important. If the medicine works, the dog might survive. Keanu nodded. His face was calm, but his eyes showed he was worried. Can I stay with him? Dr. Evelyn Carter hesitated. We don't usually let people stay overnight. But then she looked at Keanu and seemed to understand something. She sighed. All right. Just be quiet. Keanu gave a small, thankful smile. Thank you. When Dr. Evelyn Carter and the receptionist left, the clinic became quiet except for the soft sounds of the machines helping the dog. Keanu pulled a chair close to the table and gently placed his hand on the dog's paw. It was warm but weak. Every breath the dog took felt like a tiny fight to stay alive. As time passed, Keanu's mind drifted back to old memories. He remembered a cold night many years ago. He had nothing back then, no money, no fame. Just a few crumpled bills in his pocket and a thin jacket that didn't keep him warm. That night, a stranger had stopped and given him food without saying a word. That small act of kindness had stayed with him. It reminded him that even in the hardest times, people could still be kind. He looked at the dog, watching its chest rise and fall. He leaned in and whispered, You're not giving up, are you? Good. Because neither am I. Just then the door to the clinic creaked open. The girl from earlier stepped inside, holding a small paper bag. She looked a little nervous. I thought you might be hungry, she said, placing the bag on the counter. Keanu looked up, surprised but grateful. You didn't have to do that. She shrugged. You didn't have to save that dog, but you did. Her eyes moved to the dog, then back to him. Why do you care so much? Most people would have just walked away. Keanu leaned back in his chair, thinking about her question. Because sometimes, the smallest lives remind us what it means to be human. The girl nodded slowly. Her curiosity grew. You're not like most people, are you? Keanu chuckled. I'm just someone trying to do the right thing. Before she could say more, they heard footsteps in the hallway. The receptionist came in looking nervous. Mr. Reeves, someone is here to see you. Keanu's body tensed. His calm face changed for just a moment. Who is it? They wouldn't say their name, the receptionist whispered. But they're in a suit, and they look important. Keanu's jaw tightened. He looked at the dog, then at the girl. Stay here with him, he said softly. Then he stood up and walked to the lobby. A tall man in a fancy gray suit was waiting. His face was serious and he gave off a strong, bossy feeling. Mr. Reeves, the man said sharply. You've been ignoring my calls. Keanu crossed his arms. His expression was unreadable. Because I have nothing to say to you. The man smirked, but it wasn't a friendly smile. You've been missing for weeks. The board is worried. They need you back. This disappearing act isn't helping your image. Keanu's eyes narrowed. Is that what this is about? My image? The man stepped closer and lowered his voice. You have responsibilities. You can't just run off to whatever this is. He waved his hand toward the clinic door. Keanu's voice was quiet but firm. This isn't just whatever. This is what matters. The man sighed, sounding frustrated. Look, I get it. You want to be the good guy, the humble star. But this isn't a movie, Keanu. You have a brand to protect. The world doesn't stop for stray dogs. Keanu stared at him, his expression turning hard. For a moment he looked bigger, stronger, as if nothing could shake him. Maybe that's the problem, he said softly. Maybe the world should stop. The man opened his mouth like he was going to argue. But something in Keanu's eyes made him stop. He sighed, shaking his head. You're impossible. Then he turned and walked out into the night. Keanu stood there for a moment, his shoulders relaxing. Then he turned back toward the clinic. His mind was already on the dog again. The rest of the world could wait. Right now, this was the only thing that mattered. When he walked back into the room, the girl was still sitting by the table, watching the dog. She glanced up at him, noticing the tension on his face. Everything okay? She asked. Keanu nodded, brushing it off. Yeah. Just some unfinished business. The girl tilted her head, watching him closely. You're not just a regular guy, are you? He chuckled softly and sat back down. I'm as regular as anyone else. She looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she asked, Do you think he'll make it? She pointed at the dog. Keanu looked at the frail animal, listening to the soft beep of the machines. I don't know, he admitted. But sometimes all anyone needs is a chance. The girl leaned forward, looking curious. Can I ask you something? Why were you sitting on that bench earlier? You looked like you were waiting for something, or someone. Keanu's eyes darkened a little. He looked down at the floor, thinking carefully before he spoke. Sometimes when life gets too loud, I need to step away. Sit somewhere quiet. It's the only way I can remember what really matters. The girl frowned, confused. But you're famous, right? You could be anywhere in the world, doing anything you want. Why spend your time like this? Keanu gave a small smile, but there was sadness in his eyes. The world we see isn't always the world that matters, he said softly. Being famous doesn't fix everything. Sometimes what's broken isn't outside, it's inside. He gently tapped his chest. The girl didn't know what to say. Before she could speak, the dog made a tiny sound, a weak whimper. Both of them quickly turned their attention to him. He moved, the girl said in a hopeful whisper, her face lighting up. Keanu reached out, running his fingers through the dog's fur. That's it, buddy. Keep fighting, he said gently. Just then, Dr. Evelyn Carter walked in. She looked surprised to see the dog moving. She checked the machine beside him and smiled. That's a good sign. He's responding to the treatment. Keanu let out a breath, feeling a little lighter. So he has a chance? Dr. Evelyn Carter nodded. It's still early, but if he keeps getting better through the night, his chances are good. The girl grinned and looked at Keanu. See? Your kindness helped. But Keanu shook his head. Kindness isn't about getting something back, he said softly. It's about doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Dr. Evelyn Carter glanced at the clock. I'll keep an eye on him tonight. You both should go rest. The girl hesitated before standing up. I guess I should go home, she said, though she didn't seem to want to leave. She looked at Keanu. Will you be here tomorrow? Keanu nodded. Yeah, I'll be here. She smiled and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned and teased, Good night, Mr. Regular Guy. Keanu chuckled softly. When the door closed, he turned back to the dog, his face warm and gentle. He pulled his chair closer, resting his hand on the table beside the sleeping animal. You have a lot of people cheering for you, he whispered. Now it's your turn to show us what you've got. The room fell silent again. The only sounds were the soft beeps of the machines. Outside, the big city kept moving, cars, people, lights. But Keanu didn't need any of that right now. He didn't need the noise or the fame. All he needed was the small, steady heartbeat of a dog that was still holding on. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. The morning sunlight streamed through the clinic window, filling the room with a soft golden glow. Keanu had stayed the whole night in the chair, his head resting on his arm beside the dog. A faint sound made him stir. Scrape, scrape. Keanu's eyes snapped open. The dog was moving. Its paws twitched against the table and then, slowly, its eyes opened. Keanu sat up, his heart pounding. Hey there, he whispered, his voice gentle. You made it through the night. Good job, buddy. A few seconds later, Dr. Evelyn Carter walked in. When she saw the dog awake, her eyes widened in surprise. Well, look at that, she said, hurrying over to check his vitals. It's a miracle he made it this far. Keanu smiled, feeling a wave of relief. He's stronger than most people think. Dr. Evelyn Carter adjusted the 4 and looked at Keanu. He's still weak, but if he keeps improving, he could leave in a few days. That is, if someone is willing to take care of him. Keanu didn't even hesitate. I'll take him. Dr. Evelyn Carter raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? He'll need a lot of time and care. Keanu nodded, his voice steady. I'm sure. Dr. Evelyn Carter smiled and went to prepare the paperwork. The dog shifted again, turning his head slowly toward Keanu. Their eyes met. For a moment, it felt like the whole world shrank down to just the two of them. You're not alone anymore, Keanu whispered. We'll figure this out together. A soft knock on the door made Keanu look up. It was the girl from last night. She peeked in, smiling shyly. I brought coffee, she said, holding up 2 cups. Keanu chuckled. You're persistent. She handed him a cup and glanced at the dog. Wow, he looks so much better. You really helped him. Keanu shook his head. It wasn't just me. He fought hard too. The girl sat down beside him. I still don't get it, she admitted. Why do you care so much? Most people wouldn't stop to help, let alone do all this. Keanu set his coffee down and thought for a moment. Then he said, maybe because I know what it feels like to be ignored. To be fighting a battle no one sees. She frowned, confused. But you're Keanu Reeves. You're rich, famous. Everyone loves you. How could you ever feel overlooked? Keanu smiled, but there was sadness behind it. Fame doesn't make pain go away. It just hides it behind a bigger curtain. Before the girl could ask more, the clinic door opened again. This time it wasn't a stranger. It was the man in the suit from the night before. Keanu, the man said sharply. His voice was firm, demanding attention. We need to talk. Now. Keanu's face hardened. I told you, I'm done with this. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. You can't just walk away. There are contracts, endorsements, people depending on you. Do you know how much trouble you've caused? The girl watched, confused and uneasy. She whispered to Keanu, what's going on? Keanu didn't take his eyes off the man. This has nothing to do with you, he said. Leave. But the man didn't move. You think you can play the hero and everything will be fine? It doesn't work like that, Keanu. You owe people answers. Keanu stood up. His voice was calm but firm. The only thing I owe is to myself. To do what I believe is right. If that causes problems for you, that's not my issue. The man clenched his jaw. For a moment, it looked like he was going to argue. Then his eyes flicked to the dog, to the girl. Something in his face changed. Fine, he said stiffly. But this isn't over. He turned and walked out without another word. The room stayed quiet for a few moments. The girl looked at Keanu, her voice small. Who was that? Keanu ran a hand through his hair. Someone who thinks they know what's best for me. She hesitated. And, do they? Keanu looked at her and smiled softly. No. Only we get to decide what's best for us. The dog let out a tiny, weak bark. It almost sounded like he agreed. Keanu chuckled, reaching out to pet him. Looks like we've got some work to do, he said gently. But we'll figure it out. One step at a time. The morning sunlight kept pouring in, warm and golden. It felt like the start of something new. Not just for the dog. Not just for Keanu. But maybe for all of them. 2 weeks later, the clinic was just a memory. The dog, now named Rusty, was living with Keanu in his quiet little house outside the city. The Rusties that once covered his body were gone, but scars remained, telling the story of his survival. But despite everything, Rusty's spirit was strong. He followed Keanu everywhere, his tail wagging with happiness. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was family. Keanu sat on the porch watching Rusty, his dog, chase a ball around the yard. Next to him, a girl named Sophie sipped her tea. She came over often now, bringing food for Rusty and telling stories about her life. She was younger than she looked, only 22, and had been through some hard times. But now, she seemed happier, like a little light had come back into her eyes. "Do you ever think about how one moment can change everything?" Sophie asked, breaking the quiet. Keanu tilted his head and looked at her. "All the time," he said. Sophie smiled and watched Rusty play. "I was so close to giving up that night," she said. "On a lot of things. And then I met you and him." She nodded toward Rusty. "It's like you both reminded me that there's still good in the world." Keanu didn't answer right away. He leaned back, still watching Rusty run around. "It's funny," he said after a while. "People think being kind is about helping others. But sometimes it helps you too." Sophie turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" Keanu's voice was soft. "Before I found him, I was lost. I was tired of all the noise, the expectations, and the things people wanted me to be. But taking care of him, it gave me something real. Something that wasn't about movies or fame." Sophie looked at him, curious. "Is that why you walked away from that man who was yelling at you at the clinic?" Keanu chuckled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "That man was my agent, at least he used to be. He wanted me to do more movies, more interviews, more of everything I didn't want." "And you said no?" Sophie asked, surprised. "I didn't just say no," Keanu said. "I walked away from all of it." He looked at her, his face calm. "Sometimes to find out who you really are, you have to let go of everything else." Sophie was quiet for a moment, thinking about his words. Then she asked, "Do you regret it?" Keanu shook his head. "Not for a second." Before Sophie could say anything else, Rusty ran up to the porch and dropped the ball at Keanu's feet. He barked happily, his tail wagging fast. Keanu laughed and picked up the ball. Okay, one more time." He threw it and Rusty ran after it. Just then they heard a car coming. Tires crunched on the gravel driveway. A shiny black car pulled up, its windows dark so they couldn't see inside. Keanu's face changed, he looked more serious now. Sophie glanced at him. "A friend of yours?" "Not exactly," Keanu muttered as he stood up. The car door opened and a tall woman in a fancy business suit stepped out. She looked serious and professional. Her eyes found Keanu right away. "Mr. Reeves," she said. "We need to talk." Keanu crossed his arms. His voice was calm but firm. "If this is about the contracts, I already told them." "This isn't about contracts," the woman interrupted. "It's about the foundation." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "What foundation?" The woman stepped closer and lowered her voice. "The Animal Rescue Foundation that you secretly find. Someone found out and now the news is everywhere." Sophie's eyes went wide. She looked at Keanu. "You help rescue animals?" Keanu didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened as he looked at the woman. "And what do they want?" he finally asked. "They want an exclusive story," the woman said. "Reporters are digging into your money, your donations, everything. They're turning it into a big news story. Keanu Reeves, secret hero of abandoned animals. It's already going viral." Keanu sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Great. Just what I needed." Sophie spoke up, her voice soft. "But isn't that a good thing? People will know you're helping." Keanu shook his head. "It's not about me. It's about animals. Once the media gets involved, it stops being about saving them and starts being about headlines." The woman nodded. "That's why I'm here. If you want to control the story, you need to say something. If not, they'll make up their own version." Keanu was quiet for a long time. His eyes looked far away like he was thinking hard. Then he said, "I don't care about the story. Let them say whatever they want. As long as the animals get help, that's all that matters." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "I'll do what I can to stop it from getting out of control." She turned and walked back to her car. Sophie looked at Keanu. "Why don't you want people to know? What you're doing is amazing." Keanu looked at her, his face soft. "Because it's not about me. It never was." Rusty barked again as if agreeing. Keanu smiled a little. "Let's just focus on what matters," he said, "making sure they're okay. The rest will take care of itself." As the car drove away, Sophie watched Keanu. She realized that, under all the fame and the big stories, Keanu Reeves was just a man trying to do something good. And that, she thought, was what made him truly special. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.